So good morning, everyone. Thanks for choosing our session on developmental criminology this morning. I'd just like to start by quickly acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we're gathering today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We at Boxar would like to extend our respect to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people joining us here today. For those not in the know, developmental criminology is the study of the dynamics between personal, social and environmental factors that occur throughout an individual's life, and how these factors might shape the onset, persistence and desistance of criminal behaviours. In line with this, today we have three amazing speakers coming up who are going to discuss early risk and protective factors relating to offending behaviours. First up, I'd like to welcome Stacy Tzoumakis from Griffith University up to the stage. Stacy.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning all the way down the hallway. No one got lost. So I'm Stacy Tzoumakis. I'm a senior research fellow at the Griffith Criminology Institute. And today I'm talking about some work I've been doing on with a large interdisciplinary team of researchers. All my co-authors are here, listed here. And I always write these giant long titles, and I regret it when I have to do these talks because they're too long to say. But it's about looking at a wide range of levels of involvement with child protective services and contact with police as both a victim and a person of interest. So first I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians, the Gadigal people, the land that we're meeting on. It's particularly important when we're talking about things like criminal justice contact and child protection contact and this type of research, because there's just a horrifying overrepresentation of Indigenous people. So I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. What people? So first, the background. The idea behind this was to look at that well-established relationship between child maltreatment, offending, victimization. Anyone here who's worked with child protective services or youth justice, it's not a surprise that there's this huge overlap between the two. This particular paper that I'm talking about today is an outcome of a national health and medical research partnership grant with the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice as the government partner. So, it's not a surprise. There's this really strong relationship between the two. We're starting to talk a lot more about crossover youth and dual system youth. But we don't really understand that much about the nature and specificity of the work, and there's a lot of measurement issues, smaller sample sizes, and a lot of the work in this area is based on high risk, incarcerated youth, which is obviously really important. We need to know about that, but it's not generalizable, and it's difficult from a policy perspective to make broad decisions and funding decisions when we don't know what's going on on a larger scale. And then a lot of the research relies only on substantiated maltreatment, which obviously is important, but we really do underestimate the impact of maltreatment. So finally, there's also more and more evidence suggesting that gender really matters in this space. One of my things that I always bang on about is we're always focused on the men and the boys because they fill up our systems, but guess what? Those men and boys have mothers that are involved with the criminal justice system, and I think we need to have a look at how gender moderates that relationship. So there was a recent review that was really good that highlighted that on the overlap between child protection and offending. So I'm drawing on data from a large longitudinal New South Wales data set of intergenerational, we have parents and kids, we have over 70,000 people, and the aim of the study was really to look at that magnitude of association between different levels of child protection involvement and contact with police as a victim and an offender. We chose cutoffs based on developmental periods, wanting to look at that early and middle childhood period to predict later childhood and early adolescent covariates. So that was the main goal. We have this giant sample, so let's take advantage of it and look at all the different levels we can, and then also take a look at the girls and boys separately. So the data that I'm drawing from today is the New South Wales Child Development Study. It's a statewide prospective longitudinal study. It uses successive waves administered record linkage. Today's talk is based on data from the second wave when the kids were up to age 14, but we've just updated, and some of you I know are data custodians of this data, updated it to age 17 for the data. So it's a really large interdisciplinary study. I'm one of the only criminologists on it, so I'm obsessed with all the crime outcomes and the police contact and the Boxar data, but we have everything from NAPLAN to the Australian Early Development Census. We even have Commonwealth data on MBS and PBS and that sort of thing. So we don't conduct the linkage. The Cheryl, the Center for Health Record Linkage, conducts it. And the study is led at UNSW in the School of Psychiatry by Professor Melissa Green. So yeah, it was kind of, the thought was to bring together a giant interdisciplinary team of researchers. And the main idea of the original researchers, Melissa Green and Von Carr, started the study was to look at psychosis and mental health problems. And then we just kept getting more and more crime data. And that's what I kind of look at. So we only ever get de-identified data on all these kids. So there's two cohort profile papers there, one for, we did the age 5 linkage and then the age 14 linkage. And the age 17 linkage is currently under review, which might take a long time, as our keynote this morning explained as well. So there's 91,000 kids in the original sample, and I really wanted to control for intergenerational parental offending, so we link using the birth records, so we lose about 16,000 to include the parents in the study. And then to really make sure my reference groups were clean, to remove any of those with only police contact prior to the age cutoff. We removed a couple of thousand kids as well, and then, there's lots of advantages and disadvantages to administrative data, but we don't have a lot of missing data on the covariates, thankfully, so our final sample was 71,465. So our outcome variable is police contact. So I'm not sure if there's anyone from New South Wales Police here today, but we work with their statisticians to gather all the COPS data. So that's all criminal incidents. So anything reported to or detected by the police force. So we have victim, witness, and person of interest in the larger study. Today I'm only talking about the victim and person of interest. And I limited to criminal incidents. You have, as the keynote this morning talked about, police do all kinds of things from car accidents to, missing cats, missing people. So I really focused only on the criminal incidences for victim and person of interest. So whenever I talk about my outcome variable, I want to be really clear, this is not arrests, convictions, this is a really broad early measure of person of interest that, we don't know if they've been arrested or formally accused of a crime. And then I created a categorical outcome variable of no police contact as the reference group, and then police contact as a victim only, police contact as a person of interest only, and then both, that kind of overlap, I guess, victim and person of interest. So the reason I did this, and in criminology, there's this emerging literature suggesting that we tend to just look at victims, we tend to just look at offenders. These are often the same kids, they share the same risk factors, and those who experience both have, experienced a lot more risk factors and a lot more vulnerable. So there isn't a lot of data sources that can look at both at the same time, but since we had the large enough sample, we decided to include that victim and offender overlap category. Child protection involvement, it's the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice data, their KIDS system. So again, I created a categorical hierarchical variable looking at all the different levels of child protection response. So at first I was like, there's too many levels, this is crazy, why are you doing this to yourself? But going back to the literature, I think, and speaking with our, government partner, the representatives at FACSIAR, we wanted to kind of, from a policy perspective, look at all the different service levels. So, most of you are from New South Wales, so the ROSH system isn't a surprise, but we have that no contact with child protection. So that doesn't mean not abuse, it means no contact with New South Wales child protection during this time. We have non-risk of significant harm, so they're below the ROSH threshold. We have the unsubstantiated ROSH, so they were risk of significant harm. So they met the threshold for further investigation, but they couldn't determine whether there was risk of harm, and that could be due to evidence or could be due to resourcing. Then we have our substantiations, and then out-of-home care with the highest level of service removal from the family. So most studies in this space tend to look at substantiations 4 and 5 and don't include the other levels of child protection involvement. And I'm not trying to say that 4 and 5 aren't important. They are the most important. They're the most resource heavy. But our goal was really to have a look at how all of those levels were linked to further subsequent police contact. So covariates, child sex, maternal age at child's birth to target kind of a young maternal age. Most of you might know who work with admin data, we have really terrible measures of socioeconomic status. The best we can kind of do is have an area measure. So we just had a dichotomous indicator for most disadvantaged. And then we use the Boxer reoffending data set to have a history of parental offending, just a raw any parent offending, yes, no. And then from consensus data across all the linkages, just whether there was an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background in the study. So what did we do? We did descriptive statistics for the child protection levels and the 5 covariates stratified by type of police contact, just to have a look to see what those distributions are, those prevalences are, and then just some multinomial regression analysis to look at those associations. And then we conducted everything separately for males and females, and then formally tested the interactions to see if there were any sex differences. So I like my descriptive statistics, even though you do fancy stats, sometimes they're the most informative. So first of all, the majority of the sample did not have a police contact. 91% did not have any form of police contact for criminal incident. And 4% had been in contact with police as a victim only. Just over 3% in contact with the police as a person of interest, and 1.4% had contact with both. So, in this representative population-based New South Wales sample by age 14, we're still talking about a very small proportion of the population. And then similarly, there was a small, most kids, 78% didn't have any involvement with Child Protective Services. And then amongst those who did, there was 3.6 with a non-ROSH report, a non-risk of substantiated harm. And that went, down with only about 2% having out-of-home care contact. So the pattern's pretty, if you look across, which is the way to look at this, there's an increasing prevalence across the police contact categories. I think out-of-home care illustrates it the best. There's around 1% with, who had out-of-home care with no police contact. And then if you look at those both police contact as a victim and person of interest, that last column, is up to 18%. So across the different, categories that we have, we're seeing that substantiation. The more substantiated they are and the more police contact they have, it kind of goes up. And then if we look at the covariates that we included in the model, so child sex is not surprising that we have more of the boys with a person of interest contact compared to girls. But when it comes to victim contact, that's a lot more even. Girls have, contact with police as a victim. And then there's a terrible overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as we move up those levels of police contact. The other slightly alarming statistic for me as someone who does a lot of research on intergenerational transmission of offending is the parental history of offending. So that's just any Boxer in the reoffending data set. 30% of our sample have had something. But as for kids who have a contact with police by age 14 as a victim and person of interest, 3/4 of their parents are in the Boxer ROD data set. So, we know from the literature and previous work on this data, there is that strong intergenerational transmission, but the pattern here is a little bit stronger than I expected. All right, here's some of the multinomials for the full model, the full sample. So this is examining those levels of child protection, the police contact categories, and these all account for the 5 covariates in the model. So the reference group for police contact is no police contact, and the reference group for child protection involvement is no CPS contact. I don't put stars and significance values because in a data set this large, everything can be significant. If the 95% confidence intervals, crossed one, the only one was the socioeconomic disadvantage. That's why that one's grayed out. But yeah, I think we need to really interpret some of it cautiously because, in these types of analysis, everything can be significant. It's much better to look at the patterns of association rather than significance. So the first thing to draw your attention to is amongst those levels of child protection, the lowest magnitudes of association were for those kind of non-ROSH reports ranging from around 2 to 3. And then similarly were the unsubstantiated, it's higher, the odds ratios are 3 to 6. So that's, again, the reference group is no police contact. And then I think what was a little bit surprising to us with all the focus on out-of-home care is that we kind of thought that there would be a clear pattern of higher levels of association out-of-home care, but the kids with substantiated reports in out-of-home care were pretty similar. So it tends to be seen as more serious, and obviously being removed from home is more serious, but in terms of this outcome, they were similar. And then, overall, the highest odds ratios tended to be for that overlap group, those kids who experienced, even though they're a small percentage, they experienced both police contact as a victim and person of interest. So sort of confirm the value of looking at those two types in the overlap. So everything is the same here, except we did it separately for boys and girls. And it's the same patterns of associations overall, particularly for the covariates. I think the covariates all change by decimal points. It's almost all identical. With the full sample, the largest ORs, odds ratios for males and females were for those substantiations and out-of-home care. That being said, I always want to find gender differences because I think it's interesting and there's, more of a policy story there to tell, but you don't want to read too much into it. But there were a few odds ratios like those. When I looked at them, I wasn't sure if that was statistically significant. So we did do the formal testing to check to see 8.4 versus 5.5, is that a difference? And then when we did it, used the formal interactions to have a look, 4 out of the 12 comparisons suggested that girls had higher odds ratios compared to boys for those categories. Oops. It's hard to go back. Yeah. No. It seems like girls might be a little bit more vulnerable, but as is often the case with admin data, I feel like this kind of raises more questions than answers it, and you probably need to do some qualitative research to talk to some of these girls about their victimization experiences and what their contacts with police are like to determine that. So to summarize, there's this higher odds of police contact among children with any level of child protection compared to those that are unknown to Child Protective Services. It's really not limited to substantiated reports, so there is value at looking at earlier contact with Child Protective Systems. The odds of experiencing both police contact as a victim and offender were higher, and there's similar patterns of associations for boys and girls, although maybe slight evidence that needs to be further investigated about girls. So whenever I talk about this work, 1/5 of the child population had contact with Child Protective Services by age 11 in this study, but only 23% had contact with police for a criminal incident, either as a victim or person of interest. So I really want to underline this is all associational and it's not a causal relationship. So most kids in contact with child protection, 77%, do not become involved with police. So there's lots and lots of kids in our child protective service system that we're helping that have no contact with police by early adolescence. Maybe as we update the data to age 17, 18, that'll be a different picture, but I still think, we can, it's not this kind of huge causal relationship. And these are official data that reflect service use, so it's contact with these systems. And I think, as a team, we've discussed it, and we've discussed it with our stakeholders and government partners, and the findings are much more likely to reflect shared risk factors and then heightened visibility and surveillance some of these families once they get in touch with official systems. Police, might know of them. 2 more minutes. Okay, so just some strengths and limitations. We have this large sample. We could look at all these different levels of child protection. We were able to look at boys and girls separately and look over key developmental periods over time. There's minimal loss to attrition. We don't have self-report biases. But anyone who's worked with admin data knows they're not collected for research purposes. It's messy, there's errors, there's things that don't make sense. So, there's a lot of cleaning involved, and even then, there could be some data entry errors. We are limited here with those with official child protection contact. So there's definitely underreporting of abuse and victimization contact with police. And I always try to include as many covariates as possible because, things like that's why we include the parental offending. But we don't have important things like parenting, and social cohesion parenting practices that this, are important as well. So to conclude, service provision and funding allocation, we're often focused on substantiated cases of maltreatment and out-of-home care, and that's obviously super important. Out-of-home care needs to be high quality. But there's starting to be a lot of evidence from Canada and America that, there's a missed opportunity really early on. We're screening out kids from Child Protective Services, people who don't meet those thresholds. Here, it's risk of significant harm. In other, states and countries, they measure it a bit differently. But we're starting to talk about them being really an underserved population. And I know there's, Brighter Futures and other programs where we do kind of target early, but there's this movement about the front end of the child protective system and how that would benefit from preventive interventions. That being said, as a researcher, changing that, it would cost a fortune, and there needs to be systematic and coordinated infrastructure in place. And in this financial climate, I don't know how realistic it would be to change some of that, but in terms of whether they're caught by the criminal justice system later, we are seeing that they are higher at risk compared to those with no contact. And that's it. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that, these findings are ours and not attributed to any of the government data that we received. And we're very grateful and lucky to have received lots of funding from different agencies to support this work. Cool.
So yeah, were there any questions? Yeah, questions? No, we're gonna. Anyone? Jackie? Sure. Hands on the way.
Did you? So these are the kids at 11, Stacey.
Yeah.
Have you compared it to what they looked like at? What was your previous cohort? Was that 5?
Well, it's the same kids up to, so the cutoff
Were your
was 11, but
results
this
the
is
same?
at they're at 14 now.
Yeah.
So this data.
So does your analysis look different? The
We're
same?
more of them are getting involved with the child protective system and more of them with police as they get older, unfortunately. But the patterns, especially in terms of parental offending, it's pretty stable. Yeah.
Very cool. Oh, one sec, there's a mic. Sorry.
Can you just draw out the gender analysis again? I
Yes.
think I missed that.
So everything was the same in terms of the covariates and all the patterns of association, but when I saw that odds ratios were higher for the girls, but then you look at the confidence intervals and you're like, 6.9, so when we did it formally, it was only those 4 that were different. So 2 of them were as a victim, 2 of them was a person of interest, and it was substantiated out of home. There wasn't really a pattern in terms of what kind of categories of abuse or, or the outcome. I wonder if we were underpowered for that overlap category, because it does get quite small. But the fact that, out of 12, 4 of them, the girls were statistically significantly had higher odds ratios, it does make me wonder what's going on with some of those girls to look at further.
Thanks. I'm not as familiar with the New South Wales system, but I'm wondering if you could, in future analysis, look at number of unsubstantiated or substantiated reports over time. Just because as you move through the system, you might have a number, 5 or 6 or 10 reports. So multiple reports still could be an indicator of risk, and those young people who have 1 unsubstantiated report versus those who have 12, there might be a bit of a difference there as well. And it's just kind of a curious question for future analysis.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. And we're seeing that with the out-of-home care, because there's a lot of interest, obviously, in out-of-home care with how costly it is and how it's increasing. So people with multiple placements definitely have a greater risk for everything from police contact to mental health outcomes. But yeah, that's a good idea to, instead of to have a look kind of more carefully at those earlier to see where they progress, almost it'd be a lot more work. But yes, it's a good idea, I think.
We probably have time for one more up the back here. Dan, behind you.
Thank you, Stacy, for what was a fantastic presentation and data that I think would be the envy of many people in the room, so congratulations. I have a question just quickly about the nature of the child protection report. So a report could be made on the basis of behaviour of the child, so for example, displaying problematic or harmful sexual behaviour in a school, or it could be made, for example, by the police. So did you have any data on where the reports were coming from? Because some of those reports might actually link to police contact episodes as well.
Any thoughts on that? Were you reviewer number 2?
No, I wasn't, I promise.
Reviewer number 2 asked this question. So we did a deep dive. So that's part of the problem with actually doing the longitudinal data and the trajectories. It's the timing. That's part of why it's a kind of annoying to do multinomial all the time and cut off. But we can't. It's de-identified data. We can't go. It's so and so to figure it out. So we had to look within like 2 months prior to that cutoff, because if there's a serious report of abuse, it's also a police contact. So that's what Jason's getting. Are my odds ratios too high because I'm overinflating? Is it the same cases? And in the end, it was only 20 kids, so we decided to leave it in because in 70,000, that's not going to affect the results. That being said, we haven't gotten the answer from reviewer 2 yet about whether that's acceptable. But yeah, it's a good point. It makes true longitudinal trajectories of this problematic because how do you tease it out? Yeah. Thanks.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Stacy.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions.